of today, which is Trump, trade and imperialism, the new Cold War on China. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on stolen land. Sovereignty was never ceded in the fight against imperialism, in the fight against trying to build those larger anti-racist, anti-imperial struggles. We first always recognise that this country itself was built on a racist lie. We have two speakers. So we have David, who's a Sydney Uni lecturer as well as an anti-EU activist. And we have Jasmine Ali, who's a solidarity activist as well. So both of them are first going to speak for about 15 minutes each, and then once they're done talking, we're going to throw it to the floor for questions and discussion. So I might get David or Jess. Okay. Guys, please.
Should I use this, or can you just hear me like this, or use the mic? Okay. All right. Okay, so as Tuba said, the sort of aim of this session and talk is to talk about some of the really big developments happening globally in terms of Trump's presidency, the tariff war that we've seen erupt with China and obviously also the EU as well. And I guess I just wanted to start by making some remarks, I think, thinking back as to what the sort of standard conception of Trump was very early on in his presidency. So when he first came to power in that sort of, surreal way that that's what many of us remember, there was a very popular idea at the time that Trump was just essentially a bit of an ignorant buffoon, not really knowing what he was doing, incapable of influencing and shaping politics, and that a lot of his rhetoric was just a lot of bluster, a lot of frothing at the mouth, the kind of America First policy that he talked about in terms of building the wall along the Mexican border. People described that as a symbolic gesture at the time. And his foreign policy as well, there was a very popular commentary at the time saying that Trump was essentially neo-isolationist. So if you think back to the period of Woodrow Wilson prior to the First World War, there was this idea that Trump and America was turning in from the world, and we weren't going to see any of the sorts of convulsions that we have seen over the last year. And I think that's, important to emphasise that on every measure of this popular standard view about Trump as this sort of hapless leader, these commentators have been categorically wrong on just about all fronts. If you think about the protectionist measures that we've seen, this isn't simply just frothing at the mouth. The tariffs have been incredibly significant and aimed at some of the biggest centres of global capitalism, the EU and China. Similarly, the anti-immigrant sentiments that came with his economic nationalist policies very early onwards. We saw the implementation of the family separation policy, showing that Trump was very determined to push through his reactionary and regressive agenda. And similarly, in terms of foreign policy, we've seen I think it was about a year ago now, maybe it was the beginning of this year, the intense convulsions and standoff between the US and North Korea that really brought things to, some of a crisis point in terms of the last 50 years and the prospect of nuclear annihilation. And similarly, in Syria, Trump continues the American presence there. The missiles have been continuing to drop, and there is, that idea of that returning inwards and retracting is really not the case that we're seeing with Trump, and instead we're seeing a very determined, aggressive agenda. And there's a few caveats to that I want to emphasise. But I think to understand why Trump in this way is actually followed through with many of the intense rhetorical and policy announcements that he made early onwards, I think we have to locate Trump in terms of global capitalism and really the imperialist tensions that have been building within the system and continue to express themselves within the system, and particularly the rivalry between the US and China. So the tariffs in that sense, in and of themselves, they seem like just some kind of erratic flourish of Trump's, but actually it's very much part of the place that American capitalism is in right at the moment, in terms of there being a relative decline of US power over the last decade or so. Secondly, the thing I want to highlight today as well is alongside this, this in some ways quite consistent policy of Trump's in terms of economic protectionism. There's also, I think, the element of the erraticism of Trump, and that's a very peculiar aspect of Trump that I think brings in a degree of instability and uncertainty as to how things are going to play out in terms of the imperial dynamics that we've seen develop over the last couple of years. So just a little background about the implementation of the tariffs. So this basically started in March this year. So first it was Canada, then Trump moved to impose tariffs in terms of steel and aluminium on the EU, and then later he's pushed imposing tariffs in China up to 1,300 categories of Chinese export goods. And I think what I want to emphasise again is the tariffs for Trump aren't new. If you go back and look at his speeches very early on, even when he was a nominee for the Republican Party, there was also already a very strong argument for Trump about how he wanted to deal and push forward his agenda in terms of economic policy. So he had this to say in his speech: "Our country is in serious trouble. We don't have victories anymore. We used to have victories, but we don't have them. When was the last time anybody saw us beating, let's say, China in a trade deal? They kill us. I beat China all the time. When we beat Japan, when do we beat Japan at anything? They send their cars over by the millions. What do? When was the last time you saw a Chevrolet in Tokyo? It doesn't exist, folks. They beat us all the time. China is killing us. They're devaluing our currency at a level that makes it impossible for our companies to compete. Impossible. They're killing us." So on and on, there's this very intense rhetoric. He said some even more economic nationalist things, talking about how China was raping the US, and that itself generated a very racist dynamic in terms of there being anti-Chinese racism. But the rationale for Trump's economic policy is this idea that America has been subject to unfair trade deals. So the rationale for renegotiating the NAFTA agreement was similarly put in terms of America. I feel like this is ringing. Is that okay? Okay, it's not. Okay. So in terms of renegotiating NAFTA, that was a significant thing. Trump actually at the time wanted to completely terminate NAFTA, but his economic advisor at the time, who's actually now been dismissed or has left, pushed for a renegotiation of the terms. And I think it's very apparent that these protectionist measures, I think it's important to note and distinguish that Trump isn't overturning the neoliberal sort of free market view that we've seen dominate politics over the last 30 years. Trump is very thoroughly a neoliberal, but what he wants to do is to renegotiate trade on the terms that suit America, and that's essentially what the tariffs are directed at doing. It's about trying to deal with the relative decline of the US economy over the last 10 years since the the crash in 2007 and 8, which America hasn't fully recovered from in the way it would like, and is essentially about trying to hold down rivals, that rivals to US capitalism, notably China, and of course obviously the other regions like in the EU. So I think I wanted to just again return to a bit of some background as to this dynamic about the competition that's driving the latest tariff war, and I think it's important to have a bit of a sense of imperialism and what that means. So very early onwards in the 20th century, when the capitalist system was developing and maturing, this is talking here prior to the First World War, what we saw develop was different capitals around the world start to interpenetrate with nation states, and that generated its own dynamic of competition between states across the globe, and that really spread and resulted in the intense partitioning of the globe, of colonies, between the British Empire, between France, between Italy, a number of different countries, and over the I think the figure between 1871 and 1990, the colonisation, if you like, or of the world under these European, predominantly European powers, grew by about 75%. So it was a very intense process of competition that between capitalist states, rooted in economic competition, that drove this process, and it's that same dynamic that developed with the maturing of capitalism that we see playing out today. That same competition between states, and there's obviously some things to note about how this is different and the way that it's expressing itself from that period. But the dynamic, the very brutal dynamic of economic competition and state competition between capitalist states remains fundamental. And you can see in the way that Trump himself is expressing that economic and political fusion that drives, fusion and competition that drives imperialism. So if you look at the way that even the tariffs have been expressed, Trump has had to put through these tariffs through what he's called the national security provisions. So he's designated China a strategic competitor, essentially, and under the national security elements of the Trade Expansion Act. And again, this isn't simply done because Trump has some sort of peculiar anger about China. I mean, he's definitely peculiar, but if you look actually about where China is positioned over the last little while, and I think David's going to talk a little bit more about this, China has, in particular in the region in the South China Sea, the Malacca Straits is a significant international trading route for China, and it holds, I think we've got the figure here, 3 trillion worth of shipping passes through that area, and this is predominantly of Chinese goods. And control over that region, geopolitical control over that region, is very much a result of this imperial competition. And obviously, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, the Spratly Islands and the competition in the South China Sea are expressions of that. But the tariffs, as I said, they haven't gone through without any reaction. There's been a massive retaliation from the different regions in the world. So the EU itself imposed its own countermeasures, and so did China. And the level of instability that the tariffs have caused to world trade was even expressed by France's President Emmanuel Macron, who labelled the tariffs illegal, and quoting him, he says, "Economic nationalism leads to war. That is exactly what happened in the 1930s." So there's obviously there's a consciousness already about the threat and danger that this poses. Another thing I want to note just very briefly is that in order for Trump to even get through some of these tariffs, he had to also take on, in some ways, the neoliberal state in America that has developed over the last 30 years. And he is... there was a number of cases where, obviously, the tariffs themselves, when he imposed them, led to his economic advisor, who was an ex-advisor for Goldman Sachs, left the White House. He fired his national security advisor, McMaster, and also Rex Tillerson, and replaced these advisors with people who were more sympathetic to his agenda. So you can see, I think, again, Trump's determination to push through and in some ways enact a partial cleansing of his own administration to get what he wants. But the question I think arises from this as well is about whether the tariff war that we're seeing is going to escalate into a military war and direct confrontation. So this was the case in the dynamic leading up to the Second World War, where America had introduced tariffs increasing from raised from 38 to 45%. And this had the effect of, again, repartitioning the globe into rival trading blocs. And essentially, Japan and Germany became an autarky, and these different trading blocs, the economic competition, spilled over into a military competition. Could I just have a few more minutes? Is that right? And I'm nearly finished. In terms of there being that was the case with the Second World War. But I think we are not in a situation where we are simply going to see a repeat of anything that's happened in exactly the same way. First of all, the trading relationship between the US and China is incredibly significant, and global capitalism in general, there is a high degree of integration, but nevertheless, while there may not be an all-out, direct, open confrontation, I think what we have seen developed over the last little while is there being regional conflicts that have taken on a significant proportion. I think the analogy with the Cold War has a lot of traction in terms of explaining these latest developments. So even in our, this particular region in the Asia Pacific, so, Trump has pushed and is relying on Australia and Australian imperialism in the Pacific to push through, in terms of securing treaties and trading deals with different Pacific leaders to try and keep out the influence of China in the region. Similarly with the US standoff with North Korea, that entire exercise was a way for Trump to essentially put pressure and try and discipline, in terms of, on American terms, China as well. And I think the important thing to note about all of this more generally is that this is happening at a time where, as I mentioned earlier, the US is in a period of relative decline. I want to stress the word relative there. I don't think we're seeing a situation where, they're almost two comparable economic and military rivals vying off against each other. But the fact that Trump could even be brought to the table to negotiate in North Korea is something that the ruling class in North Korea couldn't have imagined, 10 years ago. Similarly, even when we're talking about Syria, the kind of intervention that the US has led in Syria has been more restrained in the way that they would like, and would require in order for them to try and resolve it militarily on their terms. Even the nature of the conflict reflects the US position. And the last thing I just wanted to end on, sorry Tuba, just in terms of this picture, I think, that we're seeing build up in terms of there being this kind of, global economic instability, that the trade and the tariff wars are increasingly heightening, and the more sort of regional conflicts that are playing out as a way for the US to try and keep, and to keep its rival from gaining further, from making further gains, is the peculiarities of Trump that I just briefly mentioned at the very beginning, and his very erratic nature and style of doing politics. The whole kind of policy by tweet and the erratic nature, particularly in terms of foreign policy. One day he's endorsing and congratulating Putin for winning a rigged election in Russia. The next day he's expelling 60 Russian diplomats from the US, based on what happened with the Salisbury incident. So I think that erratic element of Trump does also bring a further degree of instability and uncertainty as to how these imperial tensions are playing out globally. And the erraticism as well is also generating and driving and bolstering the politics of the far right and the right more generally globally. I mean, you can see that in a number of ways in Australia. Even Anning's speech a few days ago about returning to the White Australia policy and so on are reminiscent of the way that the economic nationalism that flows out of his protectionist measures, which again are situated in a more, in terms of the wider imperial dynamics, are very much a consequence of international politics and the competition between different capitalist states. So I might just leave it there.
Thanks, Jasmine, for painting quite a big picture of where we are at the moment. Is that okay? Can people hear me? I thought I'd start by zooming down to the local level and surveying the scene of the debate surrounding China here in Australia. And the standout event in that respect was a speech that Malcolm Turnbull gave just a couple of weeks ago, which was billed as offering a more conciliatory approach to China following a year and a half of quite noticeable shift to a more, let me try and get this up. I think it's coming. We might just have to, here we go. Yeah. Totally. A noticeable shift in the last year and a half towards a more hostile rhetoric towards China. What this speech actually represented, of course, very much depends on who you ask. There's been at least 3 different interpretations of what he said. First, from Bob Carr's China Centre at UTS, that things are back to normal after the sidelining of the China Hawks. The China Hawks, for their part, insisted that this wasn't a back down. This was a sophisticated effort to bind China into the rules-based international order. And then Kevin Rudd, having spent a lot of time recently criticising Turnbull's own anti-China McCarthyism, indulged in a bit of McCarthyism himself, and talked about Turnbull capitulating to Beijing, making a grovelling apology to Beijing. And this really reflects the confusion that surrounds this question at the moment. Has there been a shift? Certainly we're not seeing the same level of panicked headlines around China than we did in 27 and early 2018. It's tempting to say, I think, that that's less because Sinophobia has diminished, rather that simply more vicious forms of race baiting have come to the fore in the media. But a significant amount of damage has been done. We have seen a slight increase, I think, in the amount of far-right agitation against Chinese immigration, judging from Abercrombie Street, if you're walking down there this morning. Talk of fears of what Chinese immigration and property buying will do to Australian cities is still very common in the media. And what's particularly troubling is that the conspiracy theories haven't just taken hold on the right, but in sections of the left too. This is from a submission by the Greens in Tasmania, criticising a development proposal that had part Chinese funding, on the basis this was part of a Chinese plot to dominate Antarctica, particularly in the second and third paragraphs there. We've heard about Chinese student visas being held up in processing, and just 2 days ago it was reported that the approvals of citizenship applications from PRC citizens are also well down on previous years. And most crucially, of course, we now have a series of quite draconian anti-foreign interference laws, only one of several packages of legislation that Dutton has been pushing through. As we'd expect, the LP capitulated to this, possibly facing the threat of being smeared as pro-Beijing, as Sam Dastyari was last year. Now, why anyone who thought that China was on the verge of taking control of our public institutions would want to give our security services more powers is beyond me. But so now we face the question of what they intend to do with these new laws. There has been a tone of frustration in on the part of the Hawks that the message hasn't really got through to the public. Clive Hamilton, when he launched his book Silent Invasion a few months back, he said hopefully that, I quote, prosecutions will bring about social understanding. And John Garneau, who's been working very closely with the Prime Minister on this question, he likewise wrote in March in an article that Australia's security agencies should, I quote, use the prosecution process as an opportunity to advance public education. So these calls for show trials give us some insight into the thinking that exists in a section of our foreign policy elite, and the risk of further lurches into a McCarthyist witch hunt haven't gone away. So that is the scene of our what is referred to as the China debate in Australia. But in a sense, a lot of this is designed to prevent an actual debate from breaking out. Some of the very basic questions here of how Australia should react to the eclipse of the US as the leading actor in Asia, these have become more or less taboo topics. In some circles, even recognizing that fact is tantamount to doing Beijing's bidding. The same can be said for bringing up the issue of anti-Chinese racism, that this is simply a Chinese Communist Party talking point designed to distract from the real issues. So we're sort of being given a caricature of this major shift in global political economy that's being reduced to a kind of a conspiracy, one that we can insulate ourselves from through security legislation and the like. And of course, ultimately, the China scare campaign has been designed to constrain our foreign policy options in Australia, to send the message that we simply have no choice but to line up to go all in with the US. This is a message that is directed to the Australian public, of course, but it's also a message that's being directed to Washington. I think it's important to realise that Australia is not simply doing the bidding of the US here. We pride ourselves as being the sort of the canary down the coal mine when it comes to China, and we use this narrative as a way of trying to persuade America to maintain or increase its intervention into our region. And this is a sort of a classic sub-imperial policy. It's the same policy that we've been pursuing in Australia since the 19th century. Richard Marles, who took a visit to Washington in May, he spelt out this logic in very succinct terms. he said the point of Australia's policy was to demonstrate to the US that we were willing to share the burden of upholding US-American leadership in Asia. So in a sense, our militarism is intended to bolster that of the US and persuade the US that it's worth them sticking around. And in the absence of any real debate around this question, this traditional sub-imperialist course is basically proceeding on autopilot. Even the people who've been fingered as part of the China lobby, very rare for them to come out and directly criticise the US alliance. I mean, the only figure who's really done so is Hugh White, very much from a position of regret that this policy of collaborating with the US is no longer tenable. So we've seen an increase in the troop presence in Darwin. We've seen ongoing discussions of possible naval facilities in Western Australia. Australia obviously was far more enthusiastic about the Trans-Pacific Partnership than America proved. In the end, this was to be an economic bloc that would exclude China and put its members into a better bargaining position in relation to Beijing. And Turnbull's speech a couple of weeks ago doesn't call any of this into question. He was restating the liberal engagement philosophy, which was always firmly premised on a commitment to US dominance and the myth that China would willingly subordinate itself to US leadership in Asia and not challenge that. So the key line in that speech was, to quote, just as it is a mistake to assume that China will assume, didn't have a very good speechwriter, vis-a-vis the United States, the role of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, or for that matter, that the United States and its allies should seek to contain China. This is not... he's saying, sorry, I didn't quite get that right. Wrong to assume that China would play the role of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, or that the United States was committed to a containment policy. This represents a compromise position, an effort to balance between the agitation of the hawks on the one hand and a growing unease in certain sections of Australian capital at the costs of pursuing an openly anti-China campaign. But wishful thinking doesn't make the dilemma go away. Okay. So this raises a series of questions for progressives who have to strike an independent position in this debate. We have to be critical of the anti-China paranoia that has emerged, but we certainly don't want to line up with the Australian mining industry or Bob Carr on the other hand. One thing that's crucial to say, obviously, is that the left can't have any hesitation in expressing criticisms of the Communist Party of China in the way that it governs China. The reports about repression you might have seen in minority regions of China are all very true. Dissent in China is now as dangerous as it's ever been. We should insist, I think, that China is not such a totalitarian state that no resistance is possible. We have a good example of this going on in Shenzhen. At the moment, where small groups of factory workers who tried to unionize have drawn support from around the country, and it's incidents like this where the hope lies. Widening our gaze a little bit, we should, I think, treat with some skepticism that the popular notion that simply because China is an authoritarian state, that its foreign policy will somehow be more threatening or dangerous than that of a democracy like the US. Now, Asia is a minefield of unresolved, deliberately ambiguous territorial issues. There is a vast US military presence which openly strategizes about options for blockading China and so on. So in this situation, sorting out what constitutes aggressive expansionism, what constitutes a defensive policy, this is not really a debate that we need to, I think, get into. What we can say is that China's relatively late entry into the race to secure and fortify islands in the South China Sea is not the act of Hitlerite expansionism that it's sometimes made out to be. At the same time, we shouldn't fall into the trap, as some have in the case of Russia, of saying that China is naturally entitled to a sphere of influence, that, you know, just as the US has its Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, it's only natural that China will want to dominate its region. The point we need to get across to people is that these rivalries are inherent to the competitive state system in which we live, and if you're worried about what Chinese hegemony might look like, you need to be against that system. It's important then that we don't get sucked into the idea that Australia can resist Chinese influence in the Pacific in a more benign humanitarian way. Although, of course, that image flies in the face of a lot of our recent history in the Pacific, I think it is likely to become an attractive position among progressives, where we're starting to see a revival of a kind of a Cold War liberalism, the idea that at base this is really a conflict between freedom and totalitarianism. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that as China begins to throw its weight around, it is going to be hard to keep up a critique of American and Australian interventions in Asia once it becomes seen that, you know, a step backward in this on this front would be a gift to China. There is a strong sentiment among elites in a lot of these countries that maintaining some kind of US presence is of value as a balancing force against China. And in a lot of places, you do have a kind of outright Sinophobia as well to grapple with. So we need to make the case that committing to checking, a strategy of checking Chinese influence will ultimately be devastating for the region. And that's the case whether we're talking about our own minor role to play in that in the Pacific, but obviously even more so for the US, which really has no option to compete economically with aid or anything like that with China, can only really compete militarily. So people will probably ask at this point, what's the alternative? What can we say beyond this? And this is an important question that the left doesn't necessarily talk about that much. What sort of concrete proposals can we put forward to get people thinking about policies that will contribute to diffusing tensions and decreasing the risk of confrontation and war in Asia? And just looking forward, and the last point I want to make about this is that this critique of imperialism is really important as well for the question of how we frame the discussion of Chinese influence in Australia too. Right now, you know, it's possible to say that US influence, Chinese influence, these are comparable things in many ways. You know, China has its Confucius Institutes, America has its US Studies Center, and so on. But there is a possibility that if confrontation in Asia intensifies, China may well try to exert greater economic pressure, for example, on Australia to back off from its wholehearted support of the US. And in that situation, it won't be as easy to simply say, well, the US is, you know, interfering in Australian politics too. Or it won't necessarily be convincing to frame things in that way. The appropriate point of comparison for what China does in Australia is not necessarily what the US does in Australia. We're a US ally, and the point of an alliance is not really to coerce and cajole each other, but to join forces to coerce others. So when we're talking about China in Australia, we need to be setting that alongside the long history of what we and the United States do to those countries who are not our allies. That's the appropriate point of comparison. And there, I think, you know, the record speaks to the very grave threat that the alliance system of which we are a part in Australia still poses to the well-being of the world. And I'll end on that. Thanks.